and go.
Okay, welcome everyone. This is the third panel of the Center for Criminological Research's conference this year, which themed on policing. And today, or at least at this time, we have one on policing situated in broader contexts. And we have four presenters today, and everyone's going to speak for approximately 20 minutes. And if you're watching on the YouTube channel, you can post questions there and they will get relayed to us. Because there's a bit of a delay between the YouTube channel and kind of what's live, it would be great if you, as you think of questions, don't be afraid to write them down in advance and we will sort of get to them at the appropriate time. So don't wait until everything's all done, I would recommend. And I think we will start. Everyone has 20 minutes, and we're going to start with Dr. David Selzdale, who is going to speak to us.
Yes.
All right. There you are. Beautiful. I will disappear.
All right. See you soon. All right. Yeah, thanks for having me, and thanks for hosting this stellar conference. Today, I will chat a bit about what I have called lost policing, or police transformations and frustrations in a globalizing world. As you might know, it's 9 p.m. in a soaking wet and dark Copenhagen. So I've been generous enough to pour myself a glass of wine. Hope that's okay. Full disclosure. Anyhow, so what you see here is a picture from my ongoing ethnographic fieldwork, where I study Danish police, Portuguese police, Spanish police. I've been to Romania as well, studying different police forces around Europe engaged in policing transnational crimes of different sorts. I'll return to that in a bit. Just like this picture, with the title "Lost Policing," and then to your right here, you have Danish police officer. This is in civilian clothing, standing next to the English church, it's called, in Copenhagen. So that sort of religious aspect to it seemed kind of fitting. Moving forward, I always like to start out with an example to get things going. So this is what Danish police detective told me, 35 years old, and he said, "Things are falling apart. I know. This is exaggerating things, of course, but still, many of us feel that many things are going the wrong way, changing for the worse. I'm not saying we don't like the job or that we don't want to do it anyhow. The job is the job, and we do it no matter what. What I'm trying to say is that there are many important things about police work that we're losing these days. Yes, there are things that have changed for the better, but we also seem to forget what was so good about the old days. Many of those things are lost now and will remain so, if you ask me. Lost because people are obsessing about all sorts of other ideas about what policing should be about. So keep these kind of sad and almost apathetic words in mind, and we'll move forward. And also bear in mind that this is a only 35-year-old police officer, police detective, talking about the old days. Old days he almost never, or he never experienced, to be honest, which is a bit interesting. So the project started out, which Ian will know because he helped me defend my PhD thesis back in the day, or he was my opponent, as we call it in Sweden. So he has heard this before. Sorry about that, Ian. So the project ended up being called, or my PhD thesis ended up being called, The Last Policeman, where I try to go into sort of the same thing as I'll go into today, trying to understand why they called themselves sort of not only talking about being lost and not found, but why they also talk about themselves as the last policeman, because of course that's ridiculous. It doesn't sort of align with the facts when you think about sort of the focus on policing these days, the increasing amount of police officers in Denmark, around the world, etc., etc. But nevertheless, they spoke of themselves as being the last policeman. And what does that mean? The study, in broader terms, is a study where I tried to focus on, as just said, transnational/global policing, but particularly on what Bowling Shiptycki, Bowling and Kopf have discussed as the globalization of local policing. So local police forces sort of inevitably drawn into a global world with different issues going on, having to change their way of working, etc. because of that. The methods, it's an ethnographic study where, as said, I studied local police in Denmark, Romania, Portugal, and Spain, so far at least, all engaged in the policing of transnational crimes, organized property crimes, for example, drug trafficking, human smuggling, terrorism, environmental crimes, etc., as well as numerous interviews with representatives from various international/transnational policing organizations such as Frontex, Europol, Interpol, the UNODC, the MAOC-N, which is an organization that focuses on drug trafficking only, EMSA, the European Maritime Security Agency, is that what it's called? I think it is. The EMCDDA, the organization that focuses on issues of drugs. So before I go into the empirical, I just want to sort of briefly touch on some of the theories or the theoretical background that I want to address. And we can go all the way back to what Bailey and Schering talked about as the future of policing, where they wrote an article called that, and this is quote there from the transformation thesis was what Jones and Newburn called it when they discussed Bailey and Schering's article about how policing was changing, what the future of policing would be like. And they said, first, policing is no longer monopolized by the public police, that is, the police created by government. Policing is now being widely offered by institutions other than the state, most importantly by private companies on a commercial basis and by communities on a volunteer basis. Second, the public police are going through an intense period of self-questioning, indeed a true identity crisis. No longer confident that they are either effective or efficient in controlling crime, they're anxiously examining every aspect of their performance objectives, strategies, organization, management, discipline, and accountability. These movements, one inside and the other outside the police, amount to the restructuring of policing in contemporary democratic societies. And although I should say that Jones and Newburn are, if not critical, then they sort of moderate this transformation thesis, pointing to the fact that public policing will remain. And talking about McLaughlin and Levy, they wrote a chapter in a book which they called The End of Public Policing. So Jones and Newburn's argument is that maybe they will still be here, and they still are here. Anyhow, the transformation thesis, and this is why I've included some of the books that this sort of speaks to, the idea that there's a plurality of policing going on, privatization, different actors being drawn into policing. So it's not only the state and the public police that does that. You have an intensification of different digital means, IT technologies, etc., sort of being implemented into policing. There's a globalization of policing. There have been many attempts to reform policing, new public management, etc. As Kevin Haggerty has also discussed, among others, you can talk about the fact that the police are perhaps not so much in the business of law enforcement anymore. Maybe they're part of a larger risk management plethora, you can say. So summing up, the whole transformation thesis, this identity crisis, is believed to be driven by new public managementizing, privatizing, technologizing, academizing, if you call that, globalizing, politicizing, and bear with me, a sort of movement from law enforcement to risk manager rising. And also speaking about critiques from the outside and an identity crisis of the public police, we can talk a bit about Robert Reiner's work, followed up by Loda and Mulcahy, where they discuss and talk about how the police in the 60s, evidenced by, and this is the British police in particular, evidenced by how Michael Banton wrote a book which actually celebrated the police as an institution to be looked up to, as a benchmark institution for society to follow. But after the 60s in England, and I would say in Denmark and many other countries I've been to as well, there's been a sort of a decline in the public's fascination and trust in the police. As Loda and Mulcahy say, puppies were not only merely looked up to as avatars of order, authority, and discipline and community, but venerated as totems of national pride. But as Reiner concludes, They have now gone from being sacred to be seen as almost publicly profane. I think you can moderate that a bit. But anyhow, there has been, Reiner argues, a hemorrhage of public confidence. So there is an identity crisis. And when we think about the police officers I've been hanging out with, that was something I saw very much. Of course, when you do ethnographic studies, you see all sorts of different things. But one thing that sort of kept coming back was sort of an expressed frustration. They were very concerned. They talked about how the job was going down the drain, how they were irritated with things, etc., etc. When you see analysis of the police complaining about how they're being critiqued and complaining about the work, analyses often go to the concept of police culture. As Loftus sums it up here in her brilliant book on police culture in a changing world, where she concludes that even though many things were pointing towards that the police would actually change their occupational culture, they haven't. And I think that's, with some variations, pretty much right. And what is the sort of grumpy old police culture? Standing or sort of being the threshold or the limit that sort of doesn't allow a change of police. It is a police culture which is very crime-oriented, masculine, likes to use force, it's suspicious, it has a defensive solidarity with colleagues and a skepticism towards outsiders, it's conservative, it's based on cynicism and pessimism, it's simplistic. And officers, speaking of why change hasn't come and why they have an identity crisis, perhaps are intolerant towards those who challenge the status quo, i.e. This is not a very flattering description of a group of people, you might say, and then we can discuss if they deserve it. Sometimes they do indeed. But bearing this in mind, bearing the identity crisis in mind, and the discussions about what has caused it, let's go into some of the empirical examples I have come across when doing my ethnographic studies. My grumpy / lost police officers. As said, I've been spending a lot of time with police officers detectives in around Europe. In terms of hours, I don't know. I think it amounts to, as we speak, maybe 1,200 hours spent with the police, coupled with much more than 50 interviews with different police officers around Europe. And yes, I also see an identity crisis, as described above. I also see how it's caused by what you can call a grumpy old police culture. But I think there's more to it. And this is the added aspect I want to go into now. And again, a very long quote here, which I will read out loud, which might be a bit annoying, but bear with me. So what's lost, you might ask? And here we might find an answer from a Portuguese police detective. On the one hand, we understand the need for policing to develop, to transform. Crime today is very different from yesterday's crime. And the future will only bring more changes. Policing a global world with not just a lot of cross-border movement, but many technological and online issues demands that we don't just do what we've usually done. The individual police's nose, that's the Danish expression for a gut feeling, is still useful, but we do need to develop to be able to fight new crimes. We need to make better use of new technologies. We need to be more data-driven. We need to collaborate more with other countries' police authorities, as well as other relevant actors, and so on. We get that. I get that. But even though we appreciate this, I still find it hard to appreciate this kind of police work that all these changes lead to. I know we often feel that policing is becoming something much different from what we otherwise like about the job. We like to go out there, being on the streets, interacting with people, finding out what they're about, getting to understand them, getting them to understand that we are onto them, but also that we're there for those who need us. But rather, he concludes, than being such a human business, the future of policing seems more and more like, I don't know, a non-human business. Quite poetic, you might say. So I've sort of touched upon this human business or this human thing in different publications. trying to argue that the police are indeed nostalgic. They are talking about the good old days. They do have an identity crisis, but trying to sort of explain in a different way. So yes, it is true that the identity crisis is also caused by many of the earlier described things, developments, the NPM, technologizing, globalizing, etc., as well as the perseverance of a conservative police culture. Yes, yet I would say there also seems to be something else they're losing, namely a sense of policing being fundamentally a relational or indeed a human business. For better or worse, I might add, it's not because they, to put it in sort of very simple terms, they want to go out there and hug people and be social workers. It's not just that. It's also because it allows them to apply force to sort of get a hold of people in the both sort of mental and physical sense. So put in the words of Bauman, the police officers I have followed don't enjoy the increased deforestation of their job. The deforestation being, as I understand it, as Bauman has discussed together with David Lyon, for instance, what happens when what is it? He explains it as when you become separated from sort of the moral and ethic matters of a given thing, and you are sort of only focused on acting or allowed to act. So the example he uses is information technologies that remove people from sort of the human matter, the human or the human condition, to put it in sort of Arendtian terms. So much like what Muir described in Street Called Politician, which I think is a brilliant book, and what Mikael Björk has described, my Swedish colleague, as the police fighting cynicism, and what I myself have tried to do. I see a police that tries to sort of indeed fight the cynicism, that don't like the fact that they're being more and more removed from the people they police. As again, for better or worse, it's not just because they want to do good, it's also because they want to do bad. And this finding, the fact that they don't enjoy being removed from the people they police, the sort of the at a distance, the policing at a distance, I think runs very much counter to some of many arguments found in the literature, which tend to argue that transnational police or the police enjoy being distanced from the people they police, that they like that sort of simplicity to it. Going back again to the police culture definition, that they like this simplistic understanding of criminality. I might have come across some very specific police officers, but that's not what I see. I don't see people who like this sort of the simplicity of their job, to make it more simple. They might say so in a sort of to show how indifferent and masculine they are, but when it comes down to it, that's not what I see. So indeed, to sort of use what McCulloch and Kraska is talking about as a militarization, or the police becoming, militarized, becoming a blue army. What I have found is indeed that there is also that they become more and more militarized. But what I see is not someone who enjoys being an army. I see more of a blue indeed, as in sort of lost, sad, apathetic army or police force. So the conclusion, to sum up, I'd like to end up with a couple of questions. So what are the problems of a lost police? The first question being, what if an increase in police aggression, as going back to how this conference was introduced, we do see many, many sides of the police, misconduct, police aggression. But what if that doesn't just come from police aggression, which, to be a bit provocative, I think is often the argument used, a sort of tautological argument saying that police aggression stems from them being aggressive human beings. What if police aggression also comes from an increased sense of loss, a loss of vocational meaning and matter, a substantial identity crisis, and not just that, kinds of police loss, which many of us, I would say, otherwise critical towards the police, would also lament, namely the diminishing of policing as essentially, to use the words of the aforementioned detective, a human business. Thank you.
Excellent. thanks so much for that. I already have some questions in mind, but I will hold off and hope that other people will be sort of making some contributions in the chat. So next up, we have Dr. Ian Loader, who is going to speak to us. Ian.
Right. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending where you are in the on the planet. I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation. What I want to do today is to raise some questions about the relationship between policing, broadly understood, and what, following a number of recent writers in both criminology and security studies, my colleagues and I have taken to calling everyday security. So I want to start and finish the paper by talking about some concrete issues to do with policing, but much of the journey in between will actually be about the other bit of the title of this session, namely the broader context within which policing is situated. I want to do this by telling you about two research projects that have been conducted in the same place, and that place being Macclesfield in the north of England, on similar but not identical themes, in very different socio-political and indeed criminological contexts, 25 years apart. We are currently in the middle of the fieldwork for the second of those projects. And we're at that point of the research process where we mainly have questions we're scratching our head about rather than any definitive answers to those questions. So much of what I want to say today is very provisional. And what I really want to do is, I guess, share some of the things that we're wrestling with, which have to do with how you think about both police in the narrow sense and policing in the wider sense, when you situate those institutional practices and their possibilities and their limits in the context of the wider question that we are interested in. And the wider question that we are investigating is this: what does it mean today to be and feel secure? In our case, in contemporary Britain. As I say, we're in the middle of fieldwork for this second project, and I've spent, me and two of my colleagues, there's 6 of us working on this now, have spent several hours in recent months hanging around in the back of police cars and walking with police community safety officers, something I've actually not done for many, many years, so it's been thoroughly enjoyable. And I want to start by, sorry, this won't seem to, oh, that's it. I wanted to start by sharing with you a kind of fieldwork note from one of these observations, and it's about local policing. It's about some very local policing, and it's about a very mundane activity of social life in which questions of safety and security appear to be raised, namely the business of trying to get one's children to and from school. And much like David, I think it's probably easier if I just read you this this fieldwork note. We go off to patrol outside the local school. Being here had 2 purposes: to be seen and to get to know people. Lots of children and one or two parents said hello. But the PC told me he was mainly here to regulate parking and drop-off issues. It's chaos here. It's chaos when I'm not here, he later remarked. He explained the problem of the dangerous junction and parents parking on the pavement, blocking residences and dropping off in the no stopping zone. The road is narrow and on a corner. He kept a watching brief and explained to me what his rules were. Pavement parking is okay if a double buggy can get past, no parking ways that are dangerous or obstructive, and no dropping off in the no stop zone, which you can see in the photo on the screen. One driver did just this. He pulled up in an Audi SUV and stopped to let his boy out. The PC went up and explained that he couldn't stop here. The male driver barely spoke, but anger and irritation etched all over his face, as if he couldn't believe he was being reprimanded for such everyday behaviour. Now, I want at the end to return to that little vignette and that the particular issue of the policing of everyday security, which is about the policing of school drop-off. but I want to take you on a tour now of these two projects, and then kind of circle back to why this particular little issue is striking us as being of some importance, and what we think it might say about the relationship between policing and security. The first of those projects, our first visit to this town, was conducted back in the 1990s. The context in which we did the study, and it was a study got written up in the book that you see on the screen in front of you. The context of this study was a kind of both unparalleled levels of high levels of crime, or what Garland described as crime becoming a normal social fact, and a pronounced degree of high crime consciousness. It was a kind of regular topic of public and political discourse. And against that backdrop, we chose Macclesfield precisely because it was not the kind of location in which criminologists generally hang out. It's a town of about now about 60,000 people. It's about 30 kilometers south of Manchester in the north of England. It's relatively prosperous, though it has some pockets of poverty, and it's relatively safe, though it was not then and is not now, without its crime problems. What we were interested in the original study was trying to understand the way in which people both experienced and, as importantly, talked about crime. And we were interested in what their talk about crime disclosed, both about them, both about the nature of local social relations, and about their sense of place in the world, both in terms of their location in the kind of hierarchies of British society and their sense of the place in which they lived and its place in a wider world. And we spent 2 years, both myself and Evie Girling lived in the town for those 2 years, but mainly conducting focus groups, biographical interviews, interviewing various kinds of police and other local authority agents to try and get some sense of the town. It was what we described at the time, at some point that we dropped this term later on, as an ethnography of anxiety. And it was conducted with a kind of distant sociological curiosity. So we had this kind of ethnographic proximity to the town, and the people who lived there and the kinds of things that they worried about. But our concerns were basic sociological ones. So there was always a slight loftiness, I kind of feel in retrospect, about our orientation to the town as researchers. And what did we find? Crudely put, empirically, we found nothing very surprising. That the people in the town told us that they worried about the kinds of things that people seem to be worried about in much of Western liberal democracies at that moment. They worried about burglary, they worried about car theft and car vandalism, they worried about drugs, they worried about young people causing disorder in public place, and they were especially agitated about what they perceived to be the kind of absence of policing from everyday social life. That wasn't particularly surprising to us. What was more interesting to us at the time was the kinds of things that people said, the kinds of associations they made when they tried to understand the way in which crime was changing both the world and their particular place in it. And we were particularly struck about how crime talk kind of functioned as a form of boundary maintenance, as a way of marking boundaries between a safe Macclesfield and unsafe other places, Liverpool, Manchester, the big world of problems, of marking divisions inside the town itself, and of marking a division between a troubled present and an imagined much safer past. If anyone's interested in that, they can go and read the book. I recommend it heartily. 25 years later, we have gone back. So we've been there since November 2019, conducting a similar kind of study. We've got about another year to go. We, of course, had about 15 months of a pandemic where we thought we were at serious business of writing a book about a place in which we'd never actually been able to visit. But things have got better since then. And of course, the context in which we do that work is in important ways different. The criminological context is different. It turns out in retrospect that 1994, when we started our fieldwork, was about the peak level of the post-war rise in certain forms of volume crime, and it's been going like that ever since. So there's reduced levels of certain kinds of crime and a reduced kind of consciousness. So the last Ipsos Mori index of the issues that people think are the most serious issues facing the country, the last one I looked at was the end of last year. Crime wasn't even in the top 10. So in some sense, the world seems to have become safer. Macclesfield seems to have become safer, but at the same time, much more troubled and uncertain and insecure. So we started this project thinking, actually, we're doing this in a context of a whole series of kind of post-Brexit kind of uncertainties and conflicts and troubles. In the intervening 2 or so years, there's been a global pandemic, increasing angst and activity around climate change, a cost of living crisis, and a war in Europe, all of which have become part of both the surrounding context and permeate their ways in various ways into local troubles and associations. So we're back, and we've been interested this time, I think, not so much in kind of crime talk, but in the exploration of what we call everyday security concerns. In other words, we're interested in how people go about trying, how it feels to live and inhabit this kind of place at this particular moment in time, and to try and make something that people see as a viable life in that place, and to try and understand the threats that people perceive to the viability of their family or their neighborhood or their town, and the kinds of calls to action that they make from responsible authorities to do something about that. And I think one of the things that's meant for us, and we've written a long paper about this for the next Oxford Handbook of Criminology, is blurring some of the distinctions that we're professionally trained to make between crime and other kinds of security concerns or harms, and trying to kind of blur a boundary which I think is blurred in many people's daily lives, a boundary between something called safety and security, and a whole bunch of questions to do with the sustainability of the place in which people lives, and also a whole bunch of questions to do with community and solidarity and the boundaries of such things. So we're back. We've been doing some of the things that we did last time, focus groups, interviews, but we're also now doing 2 surveys, one of which have been done, much more extended observations in various parts of the town, the analysis of social media, which of course didn't exist the last time we ventured to this place, as well as conducting a whole series of deliberative workshops. And that matters to us because I think our engagement with the place now is now not so much one of lofty sociological distance, but actually a much closer deliberative engagement of trying to research with people about local problems and their sense of the possible both hopeful and bleaker futures of the place in which they live. So what are we finding? All this is very emergent and uncertain, but I'm going to run it past you anyway. Concerns with anti-social behaviour, it's come to be called in this country. Though much of what now is registering in terms of concerns with vulnerable children of various kinds, concerns with drugs, concerns with various kinds of vulnerability around, not just around things like mental health, about isolation, around domestic abuse, around homelessness, around addiction, a whole series of what we're calling car troubles, which have to do with the kind of speed and bad parking and general dominance of the car in the town in which people live, and a whole bunch of things to do with what we're not quite sure what to call this, but about spoiled neighborhoods, about the whole bunch of problems that just mean that people think their environment is not as livable in as they'd like it to be. And that could be anything from drugs to potholes to bins being left out to litter. And we're kind of wondering in that context whether what we're observing is a kind of greening of social anxiety, a way in which lots of things that criminologists have been concerned with for a very long time have now been, as it were, being channeled through a kind of environmental lens, and a series of recurring concerns about the absence of police. But it doesn't feel to us that the kind of talk and concern about that is the same as it was in the mid-1990s, and has something to do with a much bigger question that troubles people, which has to do with something like the kind of hollowing out or decline of public governance more generally, the sense that the authorities are not properly looking after this particular place. Which brings me back to the vignette which we started, and a picture of Ian Curtis. Ian Curtis is the most famous person ever to have come out of Macclesfield. If you're under 40, you might have to go and Google him. If you're over 40, you probably know who he is. Anyway, a mural of him has just gone up in the centre of the town 2 weeks ago, so I thought I'd show it to you. Anyway, back to our story. Why do I think it matters? I think it matters because it's a reminder of a very old lesson about policing, which is that police are involved in the kind of management of social services, the management of order and conflict tension at the surface in social life. In this case, just trying to make sure that order is maintained while kids are trying to get to school. Coupled with that sense, the police officer in this case communicated to me that if he wasn't there, and of course he's mainly not there, that chaos ensues of various kinds. Something that also got kind of relayed to us by the civil enforcement officers that we've spoken to. But of course, all that policing activity does take place on the surface of this mundane problem of how children get safely to and from school. And when you stop and think about this issue, it's about so much else. It's about the design of streets and urban infrastructure. It's about the willingness of the school to think of themselves as a responsible authority in terms of how children get safely to and from that location. It's about whether or not the local authority take up these issues and see them as part of their province. And of course, it's about the whole system of what John Ury once called automobility. A system of automobility that leads people just to have become dependent on the car as a way, in this case, of getting their children safely to school. And of course, one of the big ironies of this is that one of the reasons why so many people drive their children to school is they think they're unsafe. And one reason they think they're unsafe is because so many people are driving their children to school. But we'll leave that to one side. At this point, I've got not much more to say other than this. For us, it seems to us that question, both the question of what the police are doing and the broader question of police, is very much tied up with a question of everyday security, which in our terms requires us to think about the relationship between people's embeddedness in a place, including its built environment and the natural environment, between the relations of affinity and distance between the people who both live in that place and are imagined to live somewhere else, and the responsibilities and security projects of a range of responsible authorities, of which there's a number of them in this school case. As well, I think, so in other words, the everyday security becomes a question of urban governance and not just policing, and gets tied up with the question of whether people feel they have the capacity to exercise any kind of meaningful control over how that governance takes place. And I hope I've done that within 20 minutes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ian. Appreciate that. I'll remind people if you have comments, you can put them in the YouTube and we will get them and we will ask our participants. And the next, I think we have two presenters, or at least they're both here, I should say. So we have Sebastian Roché and Simon Varaine, and I apologize if I mispronounced those. And they're going to be talking on the rise of external police oversight in Western countries. So please.
Yes, thank you very much. I've turned the microphone on, so you should be able to hear me. And I'm going to share the screen as quickly as I can. Yes, I think, is it okay? Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, fine. Absolutely. So we will share the presentation, the time of the presentation with Simon, with Simon, and I will do the first half of the work. Thank you very much for this very interesting invitation. It's always a pleasure to listen to the colleagues' work in various directions. Here, we want to present the findings from a comparative work. As you may know, I'm quite interested in comparative policing works, and I take this opportunity just to remind that we've launched a new journal with Jenny Fleming, which is Comparative Policing Review, with Roché. Let me move a bit. Yes, so I'll start with the introduction part. The first thing that we've witnessed is a kind of democratic consolidation, which of course happened during the last half of a century and might be, of course, questioned by the last years. There is a large democratic consolidation, a kind of third wave, so-called third wave of global democratization from Chile to Greece to Portugal. And in the midst of this trend, we've seen the creation all over the world, including in Africa, of ombudsman-like organizations, regulatory organizations set up by government. And what's quite interesting, we believe, is that government have entrusted administrations to oversee not only media, banks, but also administration-citizen relations and police-citizen relations. So the two basic concepts here, they are the concept of delegation. The government delegates its powers to an administration. And the second important notion is insulation. It delegates its power to an organization, but at the same time, it insulates this organization from its own influence. And in this process, we've seen a large amount of new soft or hard norms being put in place in order to guarantee the independence of these bodies. What hasn't been studied very much in Europe is the institutional design of these so-called independent bodies. They are often considered as if they are one thing, they have one definition, they are of one kind, but they are not, of course. And so we would like to here have a look with the country, with the surveys on 2 dozens of countries on the actual institutional design, meaning how government intending to set the boundaries, define the remit, the powers of such organizations. So we're not looking at how citizens are going to mobilize these so-called independent bodies for police oversight, but on the other way around, how government has designed them and has established these bodies. The study that we are currently undertaking is called POLDEM, and the idea is to test some of the very classic assumptions that impartiality and fairness are at the core of police legitimacy, but not to test it from the bottom up, but from the top down, in the sense of how does government try to gain legitimacy for its policing policies and for its policing forces. And as I indicated, of course, there is very little, currently there is very little comparative works about the design of these agencies in Europe. So you see on the right side the spread in Europe of what we call non-police oversight agencies. So agencies that have a duty of overseeing the police in their relation to the public. And this agency have one common point, that they are not police. What they have in common is two things. They usually process complaints on the one hand, and on the other hand, they produce advice to government. And finally, they're all non-majoritarian institutions, meaning they are not elected. They're always instituted by government, and there is never a politician as the head of these organizations. That's what they have in common. And of course, they come on top of other pre-existing accountability mechanisms, including judicial oversight. So the interesting thing maybe is that the government, by creating and insulating an organization from its own authority, they voluntarily take the risk of losing control over the police force and exposing themselves to criticism by the very non-police oversight agency. So they take a number of risks. But on the other hand, the government may benefit from creating this agency because they may gain legitimacy, and they may be able to be more effectively in a position to regulate police misbehavior, because these bodies, they are specialized, so they have a higher degree of expertise. So how are different governments going to decide on what's the proper institutional design? How are they going to decide on how they should shape the oversight bodies in different countries? So that's our puzzle. We want to understand the choosing of an institutional design. As I said, the public pressure on the one hand is important. It gives positive incentive. But on the other hand, the government may still want to be in control. So they may want to keep some sort of control, despite the fact that they are claiming that they're establishing independent bodies. So the government decision, the government choosing of a design may be to balance two things. On the one hand, independence, and on the other hand, the capability of these bodies. So we think that they may choose to either give independence or capability, and that in most cases, they're not inclined to give both, because in that case, they would lose control. And now I am going to, I think, leave the floor to Simon. If you can hear me,
yeah, I'm there. Okay, do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, I'll take the floor. So so to study these organizations, we based on a kind of medium N study sample that we obtained via the Independent Police Complaint Authority Network, which is a network mainly in Europe, but also including one institution in Quebec. So we reached a total of 25 organizations in 20 countries, so mainly in Europe, plus the Police Ethics Commissioner in Quebec. So it comprises 16 national level organizations and 9 regional level organizations. So 3 in United Kingdom, so for England and Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, 3 in Germany, because there are only 3 landers that have this kind of organizations. 1 in Spain, in Catalonia, in addition to the national one. 1 in Switzerland, in Geneva, and 1 I already said in Quebec. You can move to the next slide. So we are grasping nearly all this kind of organizations in Europe. So our empirical approach was based on an in-depth survey to representatives of these institutions. So our aim was to build portable concepts that is creating standardized indicators that apply to this very distinct national or regional contexts. So we created standardized quantitative indicators, which we call indexes. And to test our hypothesis that Sebastian just presented, we focused on 2 main sets of variables. Firstly, capabilities that we measure through two main indexes. One that is gauging binding legal powers, that is whether those organizations have power to take mandatory decisions about individual cases, for instance, whether they have the power to prosecute agents or to issue disciplinary sanctions, and whether they have binding powers on the police system as a whole, for instance, through issuing mandatory guidelines about policing techniques, etc. The second index is about the resources of the organizations, so whether they are well funded, and we look especially to the staff. I will present it later. And then to test our hypothesis, we measured the level of independence or insulation from the government, including questions about the status relative to the government, the head nomination, the mandate, independence during the mandate of the head of the organization, and the freedom of action of the organization. So yeah, we can move to the next. Yeah. So I will present you briefly some results. First, I will describe the main variables that I just presented, and then we'll look briefly at the confirmatory analysis. Yeah. So here you can see our indexes of legal powers. So we measured through our survey different kinds of powers, recommendation power, investigation powers, and orientation of individual cases powers of this organization. What is mainly of interest is the power to take mandatory decision, as I just described. And what we can see is that most organizations do not have any binding legal powers. Some have a few binding powers, such as, for instance, Greece and Sweden, that have some power to decide on disciplinary sanctions against agents, and other organizations, mainly in the UK, have some power to produce mandatory guidelines about policing techniques, mainly about the complaint system in the police. So we will focus mainly after about the resources of the organization. So here you can see the staff of these organizations. So you can see that there are two kinds of organizations, some that are really specialized on the oversight of policing forces, and other that have this mission in addition to other missions. And what you can see is that there are great disparities in kind of staff across countries and regions. With England and Wales, IOPC being at the top in absolute terms of staff. What is more interesting is to look at the number of staff in relation to the mission of these institutions. So to compare it with the number of police officers in the country or region. So this is what this figure shows. So here you see that the larger the flag, the higher the relative number of staff per police officer in the organization. So here you can see that Northern Ireland is the institution with the largest relative resources in terms of staff per police officers, while France, the defender of rights in France, is the institution with the lowest level of resources. So there is very unequal dotation with a factor of 400. So this is what we want to explain, why some institutions have more resources than others. And that we will explain it partly by formal independence. So our third main variable. Here you can see the ordering of countries based on the overall index of independence that we built, taking into account action, freedom of action, independence of the head during the mandate, nomination of the head, whether the head is nominated by the government or independently from the government by the parliament, and then the status relative to the government, whether the institution is affiliated to the government. So you can see that there is unequal degrees of insulation from the government. And so then when we go back to our hypothesis, which was that the government made a trade-off and tend to provide capabilities to institutions they can control, on which they have some leverage, whereas a government that creates independent bodies will not provide capabilities to them because they cannot control them. So then we tested whether there is a correlation between the resources and the independence. And what we find is supporting our hypothesis is that, as you can see here, the more an organization is independent, is insulated from the government. So these are the organizations at the right of the figure. The fewer their resources in terms of staff. So organizations at the bottom of the figure have fewer staff per police agents. So it seems that the more insulated the organization, the lower their staff, which supports our hypothesis that governments either choose to create capable organizations that they can control, or independent organizations, but that have no means of action. We have other correlations that corroborate this view. For instance, we looked at whether the organization is enshrined in the constitution, with the idea that when an organization is constitutionalized, it is more insulated from the government, as it is more difficult to change its remits and the legal or even to suppress or replace the organization. And what we find is that organizations that are not in the constitution have more means, which is so an interesting finding. And finally, what we also found is that there is a difference between organizations in their mission. So some have the mission to audit the practices of the services or agents beyond individual cases to search for systemic dysfunction. And what we find is that paradoxically, institutions that have this mission of search for systemic dysfunction have fewer resources. And our interpretation is that governments have no interest in funding organizations that will criticize their own action. So if I summarize the results, what we found, we didn't describe it there, is that the capability of organization is not well explained by the age of the organization or by the scope of their mission, but is best explained by shallow independence, less independence, meaning more resources. So the conclusion is that under public pressure for independent governments do not put all eggs in the same basket. They either create formally independent but practically weak bodies, or practically strong but formally subordinate bodies. And in the future, we would like to investigate the determinants of the choice between these two distinct trade-offs. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope we were quite on time.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a tremendous amount of information there. So I look forward to the discussion. And our final panelist is Dr. Peter K. Manning. So Peter, I think you just need to unmute yourself and we're good to go.
Yes.
There, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. As you said, Kevin, the detail and imagination in these presentations is quite extraordinary, and my talk is primarily, I have to hedge, of course, immediately that I have really only issues, not predictions about the nature of policing, and I'm trying to be somewhat modest about it, although part of what I'm discussing is the results of my work in Ireland and Northern Ireland, and it's an ethnography. But I want to just sketch 3 or 4 kinds of issues. And I have to say, for those of you who may or may not know, I've been called the most critical person of the police all my career. Well, the fact is, I know a lot about what goes on, and I've never been told that I've been wrong about that. There have been particular facts. But anyway, first of all, as Egon Bittner says almost immediately in his book, the police are an archaic organization, administratively, in health and welfare concerns of the employees and the officers, and basically, although these talks today have been extremely informative about the nature of what I would call edges of policing, The core remains, the structure and the function remain essentially the same since 1829 in the Anglo-American world, and with the exception of the detective work. Policing is largely an action-oriented occupation. It's judged by its members in terms of action, even though about 90% of the time they're walking around or driving around and so on. And they're basically a kind of individual collection of entrepreneurs. They take the work as a kind of property, and they admire each other, those who are able to sustain that same kind of approach. Therefore, sharing information is relatively rare. The second big point is that the policing, I particularly enjoyed Ian's talk about the everyday security issues that are certainly unfolding. I would put it another way, and without using it as a pejorative, policing is basically looking after the other. Now, that other can take many shapes and many contents, and I would call it a shape shifter, the other. And it's very difficult to predict or to understand that deeply how it arises, but it's fairly clear that it's the other. And again, as Ian said, what's interesting about it is when you ask people about specific things, it's been the same list for 50 years, except for the addition, I think, of drugs and youth. There's been an enormous continuity in that. The ability to act individually around these concerns remains, and it's admired. It's just by the by, the idea of discretion is a completely misleading term, because the law does not provide you the basis for intervening, how hard, how long, at what level, and so on. It only becomes an issue after you decide to explain your actions as law as an account. So that and as Walter Benjamin said, and also Fabien Jouvard, the police proceed by exception. They act on things that are out of place, that smell odd, that look bad, that create nuisances. And again, Ian's examples are excellent and very rich in their detail. That means that it's extremely difficult, and because they're insulated and protected, it's extremely difficult to modify actions other than extreme force, which is never defined at law anywhere. So the courts typically produce an insulation. A third big point is that for at least as long as I've been involved, there's been a nuanced belief that somehow that there's a silver bullet in technology. And this technology has shifted, from the telegraph to the telephone to the radio, to radio-driven to computer-driven, technology, as other people have mentioned in the conference, is the police value information, as Martha Feldman and James March said many years ago. There's too much data and not enough information. Data is raw data. Information is something that's been processed and understood analytically. So every police department has boxes of records from years and years ago in the basement or in a warehouse somewhere, to which very few people ever have access, even if they wanted to, because they aren't kept systematically. Okay. So the idea that police somehow, I'll come back to the idea of intelligence-led and so on. Training is much the same as it has been. For example, the Garda in Ireland, 63% of the training is simply devoted to driving or running or shooting. Tasks, not escalation, etc. Although they talk about human rights being carried out in the training, that's another topic, really. So what happens is that the culture of policing, and we have David talked about this earlier, the culture of policing verbally has not changed in the 50 plus years I've been studying it. The same kinds of themes, Loftus's, of course, wonderful treatment of it, the same kinds of themes, David's talked about it as well. They're not really attitudes, and I have always eschewed the idea that it's attitude driven. It's a certain kind of themes, and David brought this out very nicely. Themes about discouragement of the golden age of when things were really working well, when people respected you and respect traditions, and when you didn't have lawyers and other investigative agencies on your back. Recently, this has also led, certainly in the United States, competition between and among agencies about sharing information. And that's another question. I'm not convinced it's happening. The main technology of policing is certainly not the technology of material technology. It's verbal. It's interactional skills of various kinds. Investigation, in part, entails that. So that adding further technology, no matter what sort it is limited by the fact that the oral culture eschews it. It's a nuisance. They don't like paperwork. In fact, they don't put most of what they know on paper. In fact, that's one of the reasons why generational change has been a very difficult process in the police service in Northern Ireland, because the organization was cut in half in numbers. Same things, the Garda did not do that, but nevertheless, retirements have made that oral culture more flexible and to some degree weaker because of the movements, migration, changes, mobility of the police as well as others. I think that I've said this, the technology is embedded in local practices. And these vary from police department to police department or large organizations. And the way in which the technology is embedded is fascinating. For example, the Garda in Ireland, 60% of their cars are unmarked. The Garda does not have a central communication system. The Garda is divided into 3 cities where there is a systematic, Dublin, Cork, and to some degree Limerick. But the technology, buying automobiles, contracting, all the rest of it, are still, I would say, mid 20th century at best. And there are 670 small stations in the South, and those are still manned by individual 2-3 officers at times. And most of the young officers go immediately to rural areas, rural counties, and some in Dublin. I want to just raise a few issues as a fourth point. One that the prediction is in social science is rare. Correlations are not predictions, and the economists have got the best skill at rationalizing their schemes for predictions and so on. And they can be quite sensitive. Of course, they're developed on the basis of what's been sensitive in the past. But I have a few issues that are issues, not policies, not suggestions. But the first one is the role of COVID-19 and its related viruses is very difficult to predict and understand. It's difficult to understand how that will affect policing, given the quarantine, given the different modes of controlling travel, different modes of being concerned about everyday domestic activities that police are engaged in. And unlike AIDS, there are no known really, I mean, the mask perhaps, but not in the same way that what happened with the development of AIDS. And I think the movement and migration across Europe in particular, even though it's threatened by Brexit, has brought a number of changes, and I think my colleagues here could better discuss that. I think that a second issue is the whole deeply embedded question of climate change, and the ways in which climate change will continue to affect big motorized vehicles that are employed by police, gas guzzling, huge engines with very powerful engines, and those technological innovations are part of the militarization as well, as Pete Kraska has talked about. In Northern Ireland, the Patent Commission said that argued for a demilitarization of the uniform, of the badges, and of the equipment. So publicly they changed. Meanwhile, in 2012, they bought another 100 huge armored Range Rovers, and they're kept behind closed doors, literally. But I think that, for example, the electric car or truck and so on must be fundamental. I was thinking about when Ian was talking about school, so on and so on, where I live in a medium-sized, highly educated town in Massachusetts. People will sit outside or in the parking lot with their motors running. It's technically could be stopped, but it isn't. I think the mayor of Newburyport has bought now a set of electric cars, and presumably there will be policy to continue that. I think that will happen. I think it will be important. And not to speak of just simple things like not having huge cars, like area cars in London or elsewhere in the UK, and then smaller cars that run around as they used to have. But when I first went to England in 1972, the small cars that took the local business, smart cars, yeah, but not smart then, they were called pandas. I think that the question of immigration and migration in and around the country, partly a result of globalization and inexpensive travel, also compounded by the quarantine and so on, resulting with COVID. I think that.
So Peter,
yeah,
I'm going to jump in. I just got a caution that we may be running out of time for questions. So maybe we'll just,
I'm sorry.
wrap up and
okay, it is 20 minutes. Okay. Yeah. I think future of policing, it's also suggested by Ian's paper, will be as a regulatory force, where crime will no longer focus as the center of the mandate. That's a suggestion, but thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Great. Much appreciated. We have a ton of questions.
Shitload.
I apologize in advance too. So I'll start kind of at the top. I apologize in advance if I don't get to all of them. So I guess I'll just start here from the YouTube channel. Ian. So this is a question for Dr. Loader. Ian, thank you so much for your talk. I wonder whether you're essentially speaking about responsibilization, or if not, how might it differ from responsibilization?
Okay, well, the simple answer to that, one answer to that question is no, which is to say, when I was making my remarks, the concept of responsibilization hadn't entered my head. Now, that's not to say I'm not misinformed about whether what I was talking about is in fact responsibilization. I've always been. I mean, I get what people talk about are getting at when they talk about responsibilization. Because its kind of critical force came from the idea that government was somehow trying to evade responsibility for security questions for which it is ultimately the guarantor. But there's also a kind of implicit and I think rather troubling kind of police-centeredness in the idea of responsibilization, which is that really somehow that when we think about questions of kind of security and order, it's all really police business. And I think part of what I was trying to say, I wasn't trying to say anything particularly normative. Part I was trying to say is that when you, the more we think about the ways in which the things that because we're criminologists, we call them crime and they interest us, and a whole bunch of other things that trouble people in their everyday lives, which are harmful and sometimes not necessarily crime, or sometimes just perfectly legal and harmful. Which is like why the school drop-off case is so interesting. That they don't easily parcel up into different kinds of government agencies. So it does become a question of the thing that we call policing becomes a question of urban governance. And I think that pushing all that back into a box called responsibilization risks missing out on a whole bunch of things that are really quite important that we need to understand.
I think I saw Dr. Oriola had his hand up, and then I'll move back to the list. So, Tope.
Thank you very much. Well, I'll just start by saying that I was listening to the panel on my phone via YouTube as I was doing yard work. And then I thought, well, I might just join you guys and get to see some of your faces. I was fascinated by all of the presentations, but I wanted to ask Sebastian and Varaine if they looked at the Norwegian Bureau for the Investigation of Police Affairs and the Independent Police Conduct Authority of New Zealand. Now, I ask because in my recently concluded role as a special advisor to the government of Alberta on Police Act Review, I found that those two had some of the, for lack of a better word, best practices. And in terms of outcomes, in terms of independence and the delineation of a role, constitutional supports, and so on and so forth. So I was curious to know if those two were part of your study. And for Peter Manning, it's great to meet you, albeit virtually. Your book, Police Work, was one that I absolutely enjoyed. And thank you for all that you do. And Ian Loader and David Selzdale, it's really lovely to see you all too. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, so maybe I will answer. So thank you for the question. We looked at the Norwegian Bureau of Investigation. I don't. I'm not sure about the name because there are so many organizations in our sample. But we didn't look at the New Zealand one, mainly because our main focus is in Europe. But it would be interesting to look at it. So it's interesting because in our study, the Norwegian Bureau really enters the category with IOPC or the Danish IPCA. It enters one kind of institution that have a really far-reaching power. So I think in Norway, the organization can prosecute agents. But in terms of independence, when we look at the formal independence, these are actually institutions that are not so independent. The head is nominated by the government. I think in Norway, the head is nominated by the Ministry of Justice, I think. I'm not pretty sure, but it will be interesting to see. So yeah, these are really efficient organization with a lot of staff and far-reaching powers, but in terms of formal independence, it can be discussed. I don't know if Sebastian want to add something.
Just a few more words. I think it's interesting that you're talking about best practices because we have great difficulties about deciding what is a good practice, given the multidimensionality of the work that these organizations do. So they don't do the same things, they don't have the same remit, they don't have the same resources. And we don't know, at least us, we don't know to what extent they are in a position to change anything in the police system. So we wonder, and this is something that we are intend to work about, we wonder if these organizations actually make any difference to the police system. We don't know that for sure. At least I'm not aware of any literature that proves that they can change the police system.
True.
Great, thank you. I have a question here for Dr. Selzdale, and then I have one for Peter Manning. I'm going in different order here. So Dr. Sausdal, thank you for your talk. I think this is from Prof. Collins. Yes, it is. I'm wondering about the links between the increased disillusionment with policing and the increased scrutiny the profession has received from transnational race-conscious movements such as Black Lives Matters. How do the officers in the countries you are studying think of such movements and the issues that they take up?
Great question. Sadly, the answer is, in my experience at least, that they don't think much of it. And when they think of it, they don't agree. And why? Because as a lot of us here know who study the police, often through by means of qualitative methods, ethnography, etc., so the police have predefined certain people as belonging to a category of antagonists. And when they speak out against the police, they don't care. They see it as people who are not in the know about what policing is really about, etc., etc. I spent the last 2 weeks. A report came out in Denmark criticizing the Danish police for over-policing / discriminating against ethnic minorities, and their answer was that wasn't true, and case closed. So it doesn't really affect them. It makes it annoys them, but I wouldn't sort of count that as sort of the biggest frustration. That's sort of a recurrent frustration. They're more frustrated, sadly, about some of the issues I mentioned. Sort of the increasing use of technology they don't understand. Pretty apropos what Manning talked about as well. That the fact that they have to collaborate with different actors they don't want to collaborate with, the fact that they are being pulled off the streets, etc., etc. So, yeah, a very long way to a very sort of extensive way to say that unfortunately they don't really care.
So for Peter, and this is a question from Celine, and so the question is, So on the issue of data versus information,
Yeah.
what are your thoughts on the use of predictive analytics by police? How do we enable police to understand stats, the differences between oversampling, undersampling, etc.?
Well, that's a very important question. My view is that just to begin, I'll try to be brief. Raw data exists everywhere in the police department. There are certain things that become facts, that are social facts. That is, the thing that's taken for granted as real, and it has certain vaguely associated indicators. Then there's an analytic perspective that includes some kind of analysis, like crime mapping, which does have potential for that. But there's something very simple here. All of this intelligence-led idea is nonsense. There's never been any research to show it, anything even about it. And secondly, the data is always the same data that's redundant. It's just the same places, the same people, the same occasions, the same problematic in-job problem and out-of-job problem. So I don't, and secondly, I don't think attitude surveys do show the general trend that people do not trust the police as much as in the past. In Ireland, the Garda are still considered by 90% of the population as doing extremely well. I guess I do think that sample surveys are interesting around certain problems, but not so much attitude, but experience. What has happened? What happened when it did? So on. That can be useful. But as long as you're using the same data to run through again and again and again in the oral culture, policing is just what it is. There's a certain way in which they deal with uncertainties. Anyway, thank you for the question. I'm not sure if I answered there is value in public opinion about actual experiences, like Bites and Tuck did in DC, which was excellent. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I have another question here from YouTube, and this is for Ian. So thanks for your talk, Dr. Loader. Can you unpack your emerging theme regarding concerns around absent policing, decline of public governance? Specifically, is this concern related to under-policing? Is it related to increases in private policing? Something else entirely?
Yeah. All right. Maybe. All right. Here's one way to think about this. One of the contrasts that is starting to strike me between the kinds of things that we're hearing now and the kind of things that we heard 25 years ago is that my recollection, and also reading the book, is that the felt loss of visible police authority and the demand for its return was at that time both very raw and visceral. Like, it really just seemed to go to the heart of what many people thought was kind of wrong with the place in which they live in the wider world, and singular. It was about police authority. It wasn't about any other aspect of governance. And it doesn't. I mean, I repeat that this is all very provisional, but the provisional thought in my head is it doesn't feel quite like that now, in the following respects. That the kind of sense that the police could be around more doesn't feel so viscerally expressed. Sometimes it just. I mean, the idea that you never see the police is a kind of nostrum of public culture, which people can draw upon at any time, often bears very little relationship to what they actually experience. But it doesn't feel like that this is a kind of raw, we are being left unprotected. It also doesn't have that kind of parallel discourse about let's get the private police in a way that was very much part of the discourse in the 1990s. And it just seems to sit alongside a kind of family of concerns about local authorities, and about their kind of budgets. And there's a kind of backstory here of politics, which is the kind of evisceration of local authority budgets in England and Wales over the last 10 years. So the lack of powers, the lack of capacity, the lack of money, the lack of activity, the kind of fatalism about their consultation exercises, the worry about not being able to exercise any kind of real agency in respect to what they might do instead or better. The talk about police now seems to be part and parcel of something wider in a way that I don't think was the case back in the mid-1990s. And I think we're just kind of trying to wrap our heads around why that might be the case and what it all means. But what I'm really trying to register now is it just feels very different.
I'm just looking at the time. I think we have time for one more question. And this is for Sebastian. I apologize. We do have a long list of questions. So this really sparked some interest. So that's great. And the question is from Ushish Sangupta. And the question is on governance of police using technologies such as facial recognition technology. There's a lot of advocacy in the United States. Is there similar advocacy against technology used by police in the EU and UK? And I guess actually several people could probably speak to that, but it is directed at Sebastian.
Yes, for the UK, probably I'm not the best expert. In France, there is a trend in public opinion and also decision by government to widely use cameras, and there is a process of purchasing cameras to be worn at all times by all agents. And this is quite welcomed by the public. I think it's a trade-off between the need for oversight of misbehavior on the one hand, and the fact that government doesn't know exactly what to do. So there is an idea that the technology is going to fix misbehavior, and that is acceptable to police unions, to the public, and also to the government.
Did anyone else want to chime in on this?
Well, there are two quick points. One is just like the Rodney King view by 27 witnesses and filmed in detail, even in court, nobody was convicted in local court. It was federal, but that was federal civil rights issue. So there's the courts insulate the and protect the officer. Secondly, even these phony experimental studies don't show any effect because they don't even know what an effect would be. Fewer complaints, no independent monitoring of what exactly is the value of facial recognition or other things. I mean, Sarah Brand's work is excellent, of course, but I'm very dubious that it's going to change one iota of police action.
No. Knowing the participants on the conference generally, I think we could talk at great length of this, but I think we're going to have to cut it down. And thanks to the panelists, and it was much appreciated. It was a great session. For those of you who are in the audience, we are taking a break. We do have another session starting at 3 o'clock, which is on police, harm, and marginalized communities. So thank you, and we will see you later.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was excellent. It was a pleasure to